Going to start the recording and share my screen, and we're going to go. Okay. Okay.
I'm also recording to the cloud.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So the title for this week was "Building Your Own Mishkan" or "How to Read Like a Chassid." So we're going to go way out of my comfort zone and try and teach Hasidic and Kabbalistic readings of the opening two psukim of Parshat Teruma. I may be driven to yet more desperate things when we get to Sefer Vayikra, but this is where we are. this is where we are now. I think that they are very cool, and they offer a good illustration of this particular mode of reading, as far as I understand it. And it's useful to make the general point, I think, which is that readings, there are always two ways you have to evaluate readings. You have to evaluate whether you accept a particular methodology, and then you have to evaluate whether they work within a given methodology. What I want to do is start off with some premises about the way in which I understand Hasidic readings, right? The premises they function under, and then we're going to try and do an example of that, and then I hope we'll have time to show that rather than seeing this type of mode of reading as unprecedented, it actually, what I'm going to try and show you is that this type of reading about these psukim, actually, you can find it in the Gemara, you can find it in the Zohar, and it's part of it. You can find it all the way through, and you shouldn't think of this as a radical departure. And then hopefully that gives us a better way of trying to evaluate what we think of this kind of reading. Okay, so I want to set out 5 principles of what I understand as the principles of Hasidic readings of Torah, Hasidic exegesis. Some of them are shared with many forms of rabbinic exegesis, and some of them are not. I want to point out, as I frequently want to do, that this is not a question of pshat versus drash, or even a drash versus drush. Every mode of interpretation can be done, I guess I would say, in a very rigorous way, which is for that method pshat, and can be done in a less rigorous way, which for that method is drush. Right, so pshat and drush are distinguishable, I think, usually along the axis of the same kind of interpretation, just how rigorously you engage in it. Pshat and drash are technical terms, and which one you assign, right? They're terms for different modes of exegesis, but what one calls pshat, another could call drash. So I'm less interested in that term, in that for our purposes now. Okay, so
does it generally end up that a chassid's pshat is a litvax drush?
No, I don't think necessarily. I think they're often just completely different things.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
They're about completely different things, and it might be that Hasidus could have, it's just like Chazal, right? Seem to have something they call drash, and that might be different than what they call pshat in particular areas. Let's say in halachas, for example. So it might be that there's a kind of mode of exegesis that Hasidim would call pshat, and a type of exegesis that Hasidim would call drash. That, right? But they would each of those, they would distinguish them from drush. That's what I'm claiming.
Okay.
Right. So I don't need that category. Okay, great. So here are the categories that I want to set up. The first 3, I think, are largely shared with classical drush, and then the fourth and the fifth. The fourth one, by definition, can't be shared with drush, and the fifth is, I think, specific to Hasidus. So the first one is called omni significance. That's a term developed by my teacher, Professor Yaakov Elman Alav Shalom. It's an assumption that every aspect of the text has meaning. There's nothing in the text that is just there because that's how you write, right? In a sense, it's the position of Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Ishmael. It doesn't accept Dibrat Torah Kalashon Bnei Adam, and it's a position. I think personally, it's a position of Ramban, for a certain sense, against Ibn Ezra. That we don't regard Chumash as in the same way that we would regard a text written by human beings, and therefore pshat in Chumash is different. If you want to use that term, is different than pshat in a different book, because we can assume different things about the author. What we can assume about God is that every aspect of the text is meaningful, however you construct meaning out of it. Okay, the second is called hyperliteralism. Hyperliteralism means that, as opposed to in certain medieval schools, we call the Pashtunim. So if you have something that looks off, So you try and explain how this grammatical form is really, really doesn't mean what it seems to mean. You can understand this grammatical form as meaning what is contextually appropriate, or you can understand this use of an odd word as relating to what obviously it means in context. But in this mode of interpretation, because everything in the text is significant, so all your choices about how to convey meaning have to have significance as well. So if the tense is off, you have to explain why right? Even if you know, quote unquote, what it has to mean, you have to explain why is the tense off, and often you'll end up saying, well, you know what, that's not what I would have expected. All right, right, I wouldn't have expected the future instead of the past, right? And again, we're assuming you're doing this rigorously. But there must be a reason for it. And the third category is what I call deconstruction. Deconstruction is a school of literary criticism, and I'm referring to it in a very specific way. What they mean is, the understanding of deconstruction I'm offering is that the way you construct language is that when you hear a sound or a series of sounds in context, you think of lots and lots of different things that sound could mean. Most obviously in terms of homonyms, but sometimes what you think it's going to mean changes because of the next syllable. Sometimes what you think it's going to mean that changes because you mishear, you didn't realize, right? You heard a letter close to it, but it turns out that sounds like it, but then you realize from the next letter that it's not, or the next syllable that it's not really the thing you heard. So deconstruction argues that because the way your brain constructs meaning is not by building up often, but often by pruning. You start off with a vast array of meanings, and then you end up, right, what you end up doing is trying to narrow those down. But really, a clever human author, takes advantage of your misunderstandings. The most obvious way is in what we call puns, right? Puns are built on your misunderstanding of what you heard until all of a sudden you realize. But a really clever author uses puns, and your misunderstanding contributes to meaning. And then you plug that into Chazal, and you assume that a perfect author takes advantage of all the meanings, including all the misreadings that would occur to you on the way. Right? So every possible interpretation has meaning, even the ones which turn out not to be the primary meaning. Sometimes I try and use a metaphor also deeply outside my depth, which is talking about music and harmonies, and right, and how you right, and all the ancillary notes you hear, right, which are vibrating at different frequencies as opposed to the main frequency. So so this is a wild extension of omni significance. It's not only that every element of the final text is meaningful, but even all the things you think of on the way to determining the first level meaning of the final text. Okay, those I think are largely common to all midrash at different levels, and again, it can be done well, it can be done badly, it can be done rigorously, it can be done loosely. And it's a problem because we're not God, so we can't, right? So often our attempts to provide the meaning of things that are less rooted in the text will just be bad interpretations. And somehow you have to say this and still think that not everything you think is necessarily part of the text in any way at all. That's a challenging theological question. Rav Kook would probably go to the extreme and say, no, somehow even the totally mistaken interpretations you make must somehow be intended by the author. And then you get into the same issue as you always do with how anything can happen, how there can be any free will in the world, how you can never make mistakes. But for now, we'll leave that challenge out. Okay, now the fourth element, which by definition really can't be there in Midrash, although their own conception, right? If we were talking about it in Midrash, we'd say something like Torah Sheba'al Peh. But in Hasidic exegesis, you're assuming the truth of that it's perfectly legitimate to build on a body of prior interpretations. You don't have to justify those interpretations. You can just assume them, or claim or factual claims, all sorts of things. Right? And basically, that's Rashi very specifically in terms of what the text means, and Chazal generally for your vision, right, for what's true in the world. Right, all those things are given. You don't have to start from first principles. And the fifth principle, right, which is really unique, I think, to Hasidus, is what I would claim is a belief that ultimately every pasuk in the Torah is about directly about the relationship between God and human beings and how to improve it. That's what we call that dveikut. Right? It's even texts that appear to be about something else entirely in this system of interpretation, which again you can think of as their pshat, you can think of as their drash, you can think of it as you can think of it as one of as coexisting with sod, right? Because sod is a completely different level of interpretation, kind of interpretation. I wouldn't say level, but that's a given, right? So if you read the text, and this text doesn't seem to say anything about the experience of relating to God, then there's an aspect of the text that we assume you're missing. Okay, that's my broad introduction. Are there questions still about that?
This does sound a lot like, I guess, midrash in the sense that you have a lot of freedom to do whatever you do, well, to do what you can with a pasuk, So, I mean, is the Hasidic end of things the content? Is it the method? Is it all of it?
I think it's all of it. I think it's using the tools of midrash, which is freeing, but not. I think that there are lots of things that have that create freedom, but it doesn't mean that there are no rules. Like you can tell you the debate about blank verse, right? Robert Frost claimed that writing blank verse was like playing tennis without a net. Right, but most people who write blank verse think that there are rules. They're just much more complex rules, which give you a lot more freedom than writing rhyming couplets. Right, or you have a lot more freedom in blank verse than you have in writing sonnets in it, right? And there's advantages and disadvantages to that, but there's still rules. I think there are rules in midrash, which you can loosen, if you're doing drush. But if you want to do midrash, I think there are rules. What I think Hasidus really adds, is that it's hundreds of years later, and it assumes that you can build on the stuff in the past, and to some extent, it thinks you can build on the stuff of the past. It doesn't care whether the stuff in the past is drash or drush, so that opens up a lot. But I think the key thing is this assumption that what the text is really about is what I'm calling dvekus. It's really about the relationship between God and human beings, and directly, right? Not about it. It might look like it's about a specific mitzvah. It might look like it's about a historical event, but it's really directly about that. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what I think. But again, I'm not. I'm going to try and instantiate that here, but I am anything but an exegesis. So I guess if Ariel Mays is listening to this, I might get I don't imagine he is. I imagine I might get some very strong corrective emails about this at some point soon. But see if it's productive for you, right? If I set it out, see if that helps you understand something that that you might not have gotten about it before.
All right, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to give two examples about the way in which these assumptions will play out in the text we're reading to start with, and then we're going to do examples. So one example is, right. So we're here at the very beginning of Parshat Teruma, and you all know what Parshat Teruma is about, right? We're going to build the Mishkan. In order to build the Mishkan, we're going to get stuff, right? And that's what Teruma means, right? Teruma means stuff that is selected from other stuff, right? So we have all sorts of instructions about how to get the Teruma, what the Teruma is. The Teruma in the end is intended to build something called a mikdash. Although that mikdash is also referred to as the Mishkan here. And then we have a very interesting phrase at the end. V'chein ta'asu. So what does v'chein ta'asu mean? Right? Probably the vid, right? If you said Kichol asher ani mar, everything is the way I show you in the mountain, the form of the Mishkan and the form of the Kelim. Kein ta'asu, right? As it is, so you should do it. But the Kein ta'asu is a little bit odd, right? So you can say, the vav, right? The vav, we can find ways to explain the vav, but it's odd, and it's also redundant because we already said v'asuli, right? So this could just be v'asuli mikdash kechol asher ani mar bahar. So the Kein ta'asu adds nothing. So it's odd and it's extra. Okay, so I want to point out two things about v'chein ta'asu. Before, right, one is, and I see that I accidentally, I think I put the thing down a line. No, I didn't. Okay, it's right here, right? So there's another place in Chumash where we have an odd version of the verb aso at the end of a section, and that is in the end, right? In the beginning of Parshat Bet, we're talking about Shabbat. It's right. V'yivarech Elokim Yom HaShvi v'Kadesh Aso Kivo Shabbat Asher Mikol Melachto Asher Bar Elokim La'asot. Right. So you all know, right, that everybody has to figure out what does it mean La'asot. Right. God didn't. Right. It could be should just be Mikol Melachto Asher Asa or Mikol Melachto Asher Bar Elokim. So that word La'asot at the end is right is taken classically already as being right as being genuinely in the future tense, right? That God makes the world in some way, either that it continues making or that it continues to be made. So now if you have that as a model already, and you look at the v'chein ta'asu, oh, look, here is not exactly the same tense, but it's the same verb, and it's thrown in as a seeming end, right, as something at the end. And it's in the wrong tense, which can also be understood in some way as a future. So that gives you an inclination that maybe just like this law, so it somehow changes our whole understanding of what is being built here. So to this tasu changes the whole meaning of what is built here. And then if you think, oh my goodness, the Mishkan is supposed to right, the Mishkan is parallel to the world, right? And right, that's how why the malacha of Shabbos is connected to the malachos of the Mishkan. So not only do we have the linguistic connection, structural connection of an odd verb to us of a version of asa at the end, we even have a thematic connection. So right now I'm just reading in a particular way. If we go on that way, we might notice also that there's something else here, which is right. Really, this verse should read V'yasuli mikdash, and then Kechol Asher Nimarotcha V'shachati b'tocham messes it up. Right, they'll make me a mikdash, and I'll dwell among them. I'm not going to dwell among them the way I'm showing you in the mountain. Right, this is a totally extraneous. Then we notice that that there are all sorts of places along here, right, but mostly which function about Tifchu et Trumati. Right, these phrases are also completely grammatically extra, by the way, just like Asher Asa is extra in Bereshis, and that might create an idea that there's something else going on that is connected with the words Tikhu, Trumati, and God dwelling among us. Right, so that's one way in which, again, I'm not doing right. You can't accuse me of doing drush yet because I'm not in any way saying anything content-wise yet. I'm just reading so far, and just reading and saying what are the things I want to interpret. I want to interpret this last v'chein ta'asu. I want to interpret it in light of Bereshis. I think that probably means that there's something parallel between the Mishkan and creation going on. The Mishkan and creation going on here, even though that wasn't obvious, and that it might be connected to these keywords. Okay, then there's one other opportunity, which is what does the word teruma mean? So we know that the word teruma means kind of agricultural type. It means that you lift something out of something else, right? That's what the verb teruma means. But literally, all right, it means you lift. And if you're thinking about that everything has to be about dveikus, so then every time you see the word truma, you're going to assume that we're talking about romamus, which is an experience of the exaltation of God. Now you might say, okay, but how are you going to get v'chuli to connect to that? Well, okay, that's my job, but I know that the word lakach is really important here, and I know that there are certain parallels. I know there are certain problems that, if I think about this as being about the way in which human beings relate to God, become very important. So I noticed that it says v'chuli truma, right, which sounds like it's voluntary, and then it says tikhu trumati, which sounds like it's involuntary, and it goes much stronger. It says asher tikhu meitam. So this, right, everybody who just deals with it on the level of what happened when Bnei Yisrael were asked, right, or when God told Moshe that he should speak to Bnei Yisrael, and as a result they would bring you truma, right? So everybody has to try and figure it out. So to what extent was it voluntary, and to what extent was this is a typo? To what extent is it? Right? Is it involuntary? Right? That there's the whole issue with the Dabir Bnei Yisrael. what are you supposed to say to them? It says, Truma. Are you supposed to tell them to bring the Truma? So there's an ambiguity about whether we're dealing with something that is free-willed or imposed. And that also, right, so that if you think that that's what a text is really supposed to be about, it's supposed to be whether our relationship to God is the function of commands or the function of, right, or a voluntary free will commitment. So then these can become enormously rich, and especially if I think that Truma must refer in some way to Romamus. Okay, and then I'm also going to have to, also try and figure out what the word me'ez kol ish means here, right? Who are the kol ish? Right, that'll also offer me opportunities. Okay, so I'm just right. This is just the beginning of a survey of of what if I read this way, right? It has nothing to do with what I want it to mean, but just if I read this way, then then I have all these opportunities, right? Respond to Miriam's question, right? So I don't want to think of free will and commandedness as binary. I think they're in tension, right? How we relate to them. And if you think that, and in some way you have to think about that question, right? Even if you don't think of the binary, you have to think about, what elements of voluntariness are there, I guess, as opposed to compulsion. I'm not sure how you would do how you explain a hakira without going through the binary, but it doesn't mean that the world is binary and there are only two choices. It could be that they're melded in all sorts of interesting ways. Okay, so that's what I want to claim is, right, that's a beginning of a field of play, and I hope you get sort of a sense of that if you're coming to this text as a Hasidic reader. So it's not that I'm looking for how can I say this. It's this is what the things in the text I have to interpret are. Just like if I'm Ibn Ezra, I have to deal with certain grammatical structures and certain semantic structures, and I'll have certain conceptions about how they fit together. Okay, so now I want to do with you briefly are three sections of the Kedushas Levi, which is a very it's the third generation Hasidic leaders after the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. And I want to just do three ways in which he reads the opening, and we're not going to be able to do them. I don't think I'm going to read them entirely, but we'll at least read key sections, and you'll see what he's doing consistently, even though all his interpretations are different. And as in Midrash Haggadah, there's nothing in Hasidic exegesis allows multiple conflicting meanings to exist simultaneously. So these readings don't all have to be compatible with each other, and they may read the text in different ways. And I hope we'll have time just to begin to show not just what sorts of readings are being done as opposed to just the content. Okay, so here's number one. The first question he asks is, it says here, "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemor." Okay, so good, right? It says everywhere, "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemor." But for him, what it says is, this is the first time that after the experience of the revelation that God says these words to Moshe, speak to Bnei Israel, and so he must have a reason for telling Moshe now, you have to speak to Bnei Israel. It can't just be that it came out, I haven't had anything to say before, now I have something to say to you. It must be telling me something, and again, it must be telling me something about the experience of relating to God, that right now God has to tell Moshe, you have to speak to Bnei Israel, maybe because otherwise Moshe wouldn't. So here's how he plays it out. There's a Gemara which says that if you saw Reish Lakish spending time with somebody, when they saw Reish Lakish spending time with somebody, they knew that person was utterly trustworthy. They would do business with that person without having any written record. So why is that? So he says, okay, now we have an assumption that the tzaddik, now we're in a world where tzaddikim are somewhat different kinds of human beings. Tzaddikim have to be very careful when they speak with the masses, because when a person speaks with common people, so the act of speaking with other people who are not like you, the tzaddik, can break your connection with God. You can be focused on the person in a way that diminishes your connection to God. Unless you find the kind of person who is exalted by speaking with you, right? So as opposed to you're being brought down by speaking with them, they'll be brought up by speaking with you. right? So tzaddikim shouldn't speak with people who will bring them down. They should only speak with people who will bring them up. Right? And this is obviously a broad lesson. Right? Everybody should speak with people who will cause them to intensify the relationship with God as opposed to cause them to attenuate it. Okay, right? But if you bring the other person up, so then you're accomplishing something, right? You're changing the world by bringing that person into greater kedusha. So here's the thing: Rish Lakish, of course, was a tzaddik, so he would only say, and he was very careful about this. He would only talk to people who would be exalted by speaking with him. So if he spoke with somebody, that must be a really good person. Okay, fine. Now, right? So now, so why is this story here? Vine kishachatu be'egel. So now, when after Matan Torah, the Jews sin with the egel. Now, this is also making assumptions about other issues, that making assumptions that as to when this story takes place, right? Even though it's Parshat Teruma and the egel only happens in Kisisa, he assumes that it's located after Kisisa. That ties into us, accepting a certain tradition. V'niftiku mikdushatam, right? So the Jews lose their kedusha. Shechazru l'zuha matan, right? So they lose. It's a very much more complicated theological notion that there's a moment where the Chet Nachash disappears at Sinai, and then it's recreated by the Egel, which we don't need to get into now. So now Moshe, who is not part of the Chet Egel, is afraid to talk with the Jews, and therefore God has to tell him, Daber el bnei Israel. Don't worry, if you speak to Bnei Israel, the result of your speaking of Bnei Israel will not be your losing yourself. The result will be you will bring them up. Okay, so now just the words Daber el bnei Israel, Daber el bnei Israel immediately gets you to a conversation about the psychology of dveikus, right? To what extent, does that happen or not? And he says Daber el bnei Israel v'yichuli truma. So that's going to mean, right? V'yichuli truma is that they will reach the level. Right, they will reach the level of Romamus. Right, they will bring Romamus to me if you speak to them. Right, so there's one example. Okay, second example. He says everybody is obligated to serve God with both thoughts and deeds. Right, because through your thoughts, right, through your intentions and your thoughts, then you bring the Shekhinah out of the dust. And by actions, you bring yourself up. Okay, so this is right. Thoughts and intentions are designed in some way, whatever that means, to redeem the aspects of divinity in the world, and actions are intended to redeem yourself. Okay, she's Romain. There's that word again, and therefore it says Kol yishashu yidvenu libo. So that's a description of your internal psychology, right? That you are volunteering. So that's talking about thoughts. And then it says, right? What does that mean? If your thoughts are volunteered towards God, then tikhu et trumati. So now remember, the word Rome is always going to mean Romamus. So trumati is the exaltation of God. So through yidvenu libo, through your volunteerism, right, you raise God, right? Tikhu et trumati. But zosa truma asher tikhu meitam. But then there are ways in which you bring yourself up, right? This is not trumati, right? And that involves deeds. And he thinks that this is the place where maybe it doesn't quite function. Maybe it gets into the drush as opposed to the drash realm, but you have to see whether he interprets this consistently. Right? He claims that the materials, gold, silver, and copper, are all references to deeds. And so this entire paragraph is talking about the way in which different aspects of religious life contribute respectively to the exaltation of God, or of God in such a way that he becomes present in the world, or the exaltation of human beings so that they become more in relationship to the God who exists in the world. Okay, that's number 2. Here's number 3. V'chein ta'asu, right? So Rashi says v'chein ta'asu l'dorot, right? So Rashi takes v'chein ta'asu as meaning, in fact, refers to the future. You should do just like you're doing this now. You should do this for all future generations. But Tosfot asks, hang on a sec. Actually, the dimensions of the Mishkan are not the same as the dimensions of the Beit HaMikdash. Remember, we had both the word Mikdash and Mishkan in the text. So how can Rashi say v'chein ta'asu l'dorot, that this is an instruction to do everything the same way for future generations, when in fact the materials of the Mishkan, the stuff in the Mishkan is not made the same way for all generations, because eventually we move from Mishkan to Mikdash and everything changes. However, and the Rabbi asks the same question. He says, "Ach lefi dvareinu hanal nicha." But according to what we've said above, this is all fine. The kavanas hakasu v'chein ta'asu, because what does the pasuk mean? V'yadu divrei Chazal, the ein shnei neviim mitnabim b'signon echad. Chazal say that no two prophets have the same literary style. Rakol echad lefi b'chinato. Right? Everybody, right? All neviim prophesy in accordance with their own subjective capacities. Right, and the way in which they serve God, Hashem, that's the way in which their prophetic visions appear to them. Right, so prophetic visions are not objective visions. Prophetic visions are experiences every human being has in accordance with their own, every prophet has in accordance with their own subjective relationship to God. Okay, so now, what does the pasuk mean? Just like the no navi is alike, so too, Rasalamar, B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation, note Beit HaMikdash, right? Just right when you try to build whatever the temple, the sanctum of that day is, you should always build it, right? Not in accordance with the way in which Moshe Rabbeinu saw it on the mountain, and not in accordance with the way the Jews saw it on the mountain at that time. Everybody has to build it the way that they see it, right? So by connecting it, right, you have to build it the way in which it was seen on the mountain, right? The message doesn't mean always build it the same way. It means the opposite. It means you always have to build it in accordance with the way in which God appears to you at this moment, right? In accordance with the way in which you have the prophetic experience of the way in which the Mishkan should be. And so Shlomo did it his way, and Moshe did it his way, and the Ramban has no problem, because in fact the Chen Derot means everybody has to do it in their own way, not that everybody has to do it in the same way. Okay, right. As another way of framing it is right. Kain ta'asu relates grammatically, it says, to kol asher ani mar'eh. Just like you now, you can't change anything from what I am showing you, Moshe, on the mountain. So too in the future generations, whatever they are shown by the way of the prophets, that's the right. That's the way in which you have to do it then. Right. So the Kedushas Levi has three lessons, right, derived from three aspects of the psukim. One is One is that the Beryl B'nai Israel is God's instruction to Moshe that by speaking with the Jewish people, he should have confidence, right? That because of the Jewish people, that the result of his speaking with them is going to lift him up it's going to lift them up and not bring him down. And that has to be, a model for people generally. On the one hand, you have to be very cautious. On the other hand, you have to have a very strong bias towards believing that that talking with your fellow Jews is going to lift you up. The second thing is to understand the different purposes of religious thought and religious action, and that's built off the tension between, is it Yidvenu Libo and Trumati, or is it Tikhu Me'itam and just Truma? And then the last thing is on the Chen Ta'asu, which he uses to utterly reverse what seems to be the obvious meaning of the pasuk, because the pasuk in fact means on the literal level that on the first level that right now everybody has to build the kalim exactly the way they see them, but the Chen Ta'asu transforms that as not meaning and do it as I just told you, do it exactly the way you see. Instead, it's a statement about the future that you always have to do it exactly the way you see, and not the way that it was seen in the past. Now, this obviously we'd have to contextualize the vort, right? Because that can lead to complete redoing of the whole system. How do you know that? Right, you have to know that it's in fact a vision of prophecy and not just whatever you want to do. But so there are lots of radical things you get out of this, and I don't think they would be correct. But I think this shows you something about the way he's reading, Not the way he's reading. Okay. Um, yeah, okay, right. I agree with Miriam that there's a tension because on the one hand, Rish Lakish was special because he wouldn't talk to any Jews, so it's obvious that that some people can talk to some fellow Jews and get brought down because Rish Lakish wouldn't talk to all the fellow Jews. On the other hand, even Moshe Rabbeinu, you would think, would be the most at risk because of being brought down from his unique connection to God by talking to people. So there's a value in knowing that God told Moshe Rabbeinu, no, right, the way, right, your religious responsibility is not to maintain, is right, you can't feel that way, that, right, you can't talk to anybody because that will just break your connection. That's right, that's not true. And you have to have confidence that sometimes you're talking to them will raise them up. Okay, again, right, we're reading, one parsha. You have to read 52 parshas, so we can have a better sense of how he balances all these tensions. Because in each of these places, it's should be clear he's taking one aspect of of something where there's a certain amount of truth to both sides. And my focus, I hope you find what he says itself challenging, at least. If not edifying or inspiring, which would be great if you found it that way too. But I hope you also just get this is a mode of reading, right? He's not just imposing what he wants to say on the text. This is a mode of reading, and like every mode of reading, you're more likely to come up with results you agree with than results you disagree with if you care about the text. But it's not, I think, anarchic or even necessarily unrigorous. I think a lot of it can be done based on rigorous readings. Okay, that's the end of the explicitly Hasidic texts we're doing. If there are questions about that now, we can ask them now, or we'll go on.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
What if someone like usually is using or using Rashi, for example, who I would basically say doesn't really hold by all their principles? Rashi plenty of times will say it's just the way it is, or something. What does that mean? Are they picking and choosing with what they choose with Rashi or Chazal, and therefore it's less complete, rigorous, or it's compelling? Maybe that's the pshat, or do they care if that's the pshat, or they're just trying to get their pshat out of it? They're willing to pick and choose from the sources that will give them or allow them to get where they want to go.
I think they wouldn't agree with you that Rashi doesn't agree with them. I think that I'd say the extreme version of this is that the Tolos Yaakov Yosef, who's also that period, writes many of his Kabbalistic essays, at least some of his Kabbalistic essays. I think it's quite a few, as interpretations of the Mar Nevuchim. So you would tell me, but how can you do that, right? The Rambam obviously wasn't a Kabbalist. That's an assumption to you, right? We can, which I think is true, although it's more complicated when you talk about various certain kinds of Neoplatonism. So it's a great question for you. It's not a question for him because he assumed the Rambam was a Kabbalist. Now you could tell me that you don't find that one of a basis you could find for not agreeing with this whole mode of interpretation is that it assumes that the Rambam was a Kabbalist, and you think that's false, and therefore that's a strike for you against the whole methodology, that it assumes something which you think is just false. That's fair. That I think is fair. I don't think they would agree with you that Rashi didn't think this way. I think they would largely have argued that Rashi did think this way. You just have to interpret Rashi properly.
So would that hold that when Rashi does something like say, don't worry about the tense, even though it's a future tense, it really means the past, that Rashi was mistaken there, or we're not understanding Rashi, and that Rashi, even when he says what he says, would really mean something that they could interpret in terms of a dveikut end of things? I mean,
I think you could have that, or it could be that they would say, you know what, Rashi does both pshat and drash in his own world, and that's when he does pshat, and but he would agree that what we're doing is the proper thing called drash. That's also possible. Okay. I don't think they're consistent about that, but I'm not an expert.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right, thanks.
Okay, good. So now we're going to go into Chazal, and what I hope I'll show is that if I hadn't labeled everything, that what we call Hasidic interpretation would fit in. right? That's a strong thesis with a whole range of different kinds of traditional interpretations that are outside the realm of Chassidut, and that maybe what Chassidut is just doing is intensifying streams that are clearly exist all the way through. So you'll make up your own mind as to at what level these interpretations come in. So here's the Mechilta. Mechilta asks the question: how do you know that there wasn't a single Jew, right? Shelo haya kol echad v'echad miYisrael, shelo haya yachol hamit ol moed v'chol kilav v'chol krasav krashav richav udav yadav. Right. So you know that there's a basic puzzle, right? That Moshe picks up the Mishkan, but the pieces of Mishkan are very, very, very heavy. So you can work in the Midrashic tradition that Moshe Rabbeinu is huge, right? Yog Melech HaBashan, I got it. Or you can, right? You can say that that Moshe was assisted by a very, very large group of people, or that he understood levers. But it's a basic problem how the Mishkan gets picked up because it's very, very heavy. And the Mechilta here goes to an extreme and says, how do you know that there wasn't a single Jew who couldn't pick up the Old Moed and all its things? Now maybe they just meant that every Jew has a part to play. Right, so the pasuk they quote is "Me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo." From every ish, we're not going to for now get to who's excluded by ish. Let's assume for now it just means everyone. If we have time at the end, we can show some people think kol ish means to include women, and some people think it means to exclude women. So there's nobody among the Jewish people who that's not in this interpretation in a first level interpretation that where we're just trying to figure out what actually happened then. Right. So the answer is no. Kol Yisrael V'Nolo means that every Jew is competent. Shmos Rabbah, quoting the same, right? So now we move from sort of Midrash Halacha, Mechilta Roshim B'Yochai, although it includes a lot of Agada to Shmot Rabbah, which is explicitly Midrash Agada, and here there's no ambiguity. B'Sha'ah Shamar Kodesh Baruch Hu LeMoshe Al Yiskei HaMishkan, when God told Moshe about the Mishkan, Amar Lefanav, so Moshe said to him, Ribono Shalom, Yicholin Hein LiYisrael Lasoto, can the Jewish people collectively actually do all this work? Amar LeHaKodesh Baruch Hu, Afilu Echad MiYisrael Yachol Lasoto. Right? Not only can they do it collectively, every individual Jew is capable of building the entire Mishkan. Right? So we've moved from the Mechilta was talking about to stand up the Mishkan. Here we're talking about actually making all the parts of the Mishkan, I think. And here it's explicit. It's not that every Jew has a role to play, but that every Jew individually is capable of constructing the entire Mishkan. Okay, so now we go to the Kedah Yitzchak. The Kedah Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Rama, is a philosophic commentary, right? A Maimonidean rationalist, you want to call him that. Okay, so what is going on in the Mishkan? It says, "V'hu shetira'eh alehem tchunat ha'ulam bichlalo." They're shown the structure of the entirety of the world, the ofen hanagato, and the way in which God directs the world. Hu ma'aseh Mishkan. So how are the Jews shown the whole construction of the world and God's management of the world? Because right through the Mishkan, right? Again, this is a given. The Mishkan is a literal microcosm, but now let's watch. Asher kol ish shalem, in which every person, asher yidvenu libo, who is properly inspired by their own heart, yachol soto b'sichlo v'rayonei libo. Every Jew can build the Mishkan within their intellect and the thoughts of their heart. Even though every Jew is not every Jew is capable of building the physical Mishkan, but every Jew is capable of understanding the Mishkan, and understanding the Mishkan will cause you to build a Mishkan in your mind. Right, this is where you end up eventually saying Luvavi Mishkan Evnet, right? Right. So the Kedah Yitzchak thinks that the pshat of this story, whatever the word pshat, the meaning of the story is talking about, right? Even though on the surface it's talking about building a physical Mishkan, but if you understand what's happening, it's really telling you how to understand the entire world. And if you really understand the entire world and God's place in the world, then you will end up building a Mishkan within yourself. Right, and this is a reading of Yasuli Mikdash. They'll make a Mikdash for me. B'shochanti b'socham. So don't read B'shochanti b'socham as I will dwell amongst the Jewish people. It means literally, I will dwell among them. right? And what's his proof of it? His proof of it, right? His proof of it is exactly our midrash. Ki al shnei elu minei ha'ma'asim amru she'kshamar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, right? Where Moshe asks this question, and they respond. It says ki divrei Hashem yitalehim dvarim tfumim ela kishuvnu al zeh ha'ofen. Because otherwise, it's really, really hard to understand what God is saying. Right? So I guess at least I think we get that philosophers can understand Chazal in roughly the same way as Hasidim, because the philosophers also believe that ultimately the Torah is about the relationship between human beings and God, even if they understand that perhaps slightly differently, even though Hasidim might not agree that they understand them, and that they understand them very differently. So, right, I think that what the Kedusha says here, I would contend, is something that you would look perfectly comfortable in the context of the Kedushas Levis we started reading. It's the same kind of interpretation, even going down to right the Shachanti B'Socham as being hyperliteral, right? As I will dwell literally within them, and the Eid Kol Isha Shri Libo has to be talking about an internal state, right? It's almost exactly the same moves. Okay, so now I want to show it from which, right, how does this interpretation play out? So now we're going to go to the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer himself is going to be built off the Zohar that we'll see. So Chassam Sofer says, "Hikdim Shabbat limlechet hamishkan." In Parshat Vayakhel, it talks about Shabbos before the Mishkan, but that's when Moshe tells it. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu yicher Shabbos achar lechet hamishkan b'Parshat Kisisa. There's a contradiction as to whether the Jew, right, when God tells Moshe to tell the Jews, he talks about Shabbos before the Mishkan. But when Moshe actually tells the Jews, he talks about God talks about the Mishkan before Shabbat, and Moshe talks about Shabbat before the Mishkan. How do we answer that? Well, the Zohar tells you something. The Zohar says the following: before the Egel, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Parshat Teruma, Me'et Kol Ish Asher Yidvan Libo. Right. So before the Egel happens, and we're now understanding that Parshat Teruma, right, as opposed to Kedushas Levi's interpretation, that Parshat Teruma takes place before the before the Egel, right? This is my focus between Rashi and the Ramban. Afilu me'erev Rav, that before the Egel, God intended the Teruma, meaning He intended the Mishkan to be built out of Kol Ish, and Kol Ish means even the Erev Rav. Aval Afshav, the Parshat Vayakhel, Achar Egel, Sivku Meitchem Teruma, Meitchem V'lo Me'erev Rav. And so the relationship of the Jewish people to the Mishkan changes, and the way it changes is that before the Egel, the Erev Rav are supposed to be part of the construction of the Mishkan, and after the Erev Rav, after the Egel, the Erev Rav are no longer supposed to be part of the construction of the Mishkan. So what he says is that's why. So when God talks to Moshe, which is before the Egel, so God puts the Mishkan before Shabbos, because the Mishkan and the Shabbos are all shared by all Jews. But by the time Moshe comes, is after the Egel, and at that point the Erev Rav are still obligated in Shabbos, but they're no longer part of the construction of the Mishkan. Okay, so that has all sorts of radical implications, but you can see how again we're taking the parsha, and we're building universes about relationship to God out of this, not just about the construction of the Mishkan. And if you take a look, right, so the this doesn't actually relate to the thing we saw earlier, but it did. But if it does, I don't know. Okay, so just we probably don't have to do this in depth, but the Chassam Sofer is in fact quoting the Zohar accurately, that there is a radical shift between the Parshas Teruma and the Mishkan of Parshas Teruma and the Mishkan of Parshas Vayakhel, which the Chassam Sofer goes on to embed in the relation of Shabbos, and the phrase Kol Ish really means specifically to include even we might call the marginal Jews, and then after the Egel that changes. So you can like this word or not like this word, but once again, what we're doing is we're reading a parsha that seems to be about the Mishkan, but really it's telling you something much more powerful about the relationship between the Jewish people and God, though we may or may not like the way in which it expresses it. That depends on what you think happens to the Erev Rav and where we are among the Jews, and whether you think this is talking about literal people or talking about aspects of people. Right? That is not something that I feel confident to talk about. Right. So he actually understands Parshas Vayakil as Moshe, as the point where Moshe comes and separates the Erev Rav from the Jews, which is an astonishing claim. Okay. But here are other interpretations of Me'et Kol Ish, right? So one interpretation of Me'et Kol Ish is that Me'et Kol Ish meant the Erev Rav, but it actually doesn't last. Rav Tzedek Kohen de Lublin, who's sort of this interesting figure because he comes from Chassidus, but he has lots of influence. Right? His influence on the Nesiv, his influence on Rav Kook, right? So he has all sorts of, and on the Ishmael, right? Tzedek is a wildly influential and wildly original figure, about whom I can say I tried to teach his material once, and because I asked in SBM many years ago, I told the students that I would teach whatever text they wanted, even if I knew nothing about it. It would be fun to teach it as a Rosh Hashiva as opposed to as a scholar. And they picked Sitkas Tzaddik of Tzaddik Kohen Lublin, and it took me many hours to try and teach the first page. Just to understand the first page, let alone teach it. And then Professor Brill came in, and essentially the book I was teaching was not the same book he was teaching, so maybe it was all wrong. So I'll try again, Rosadok, with the proviso that I don't know anything about Rosadok. Professor Ellman has a very, very long article about Rosadok, which I didn't understand, so it's not going to help you either. Here's what he says. For God to live amongst Bnei Israel, right, to Shachanti b'tocham, tzarich me'et kol ish she'yitgaber al Yisro. That, right, means he requires every person to overcome their Yetzer Hara, which he thinks is a fulfillment of Yira. V'yeh b'libo yidvod leiv aval Hashem yitbarach, right? And when you overcome it, then you overcome your Yetzer through Yira, which is an element of compulsion. Then you reach the level of freedom and Ava, because that's the way human beings work, right? That's the human beings work by you go from Yira through Ava. So he again reads the whole thing as God wants something, not stuff from people. Right? What God wants from people is to get to the stage of Asher Yidvenu Libo. Okay. The Orach Chaim, however, has a completely different interpretation of Me'et Kol Ish. Right? He says Me'et Kol Ish is intended to include people who are ordinarily not free to give tzedakah entirely freely. In his interpretation here, the three people he has are orphans whose stuff is in trust, Khanim whose stuff is under control of their parents, and married women at that point who were not assumed to be free to donate joint assets without approval of their husbands, at least not in large amounts. But there are Chaim interesting, right? In his commentary in Shemot, he introduces a third category, which is spendthrifts. Right? People who are excessively generous. Ordinarily, he tells a story where there was a certain man when the Gabbai Tzedakah saw him coming, they would run and hide because he couldn't help but give them everything he had, and he would starve his family. So the Gabbai Tzedakah would make sure they weren't around for him to give away their stuff. Zera Chaim says that Kol Ish is intended to include everybody whom you would ordinarily not accept large amounts of charity from. This is the one place where you allowed people to be as generous as they wanted. The Meshech Chochmah reads it in exactly the reverse way. Okay, now if you were reading the Orach Chaim in a Hasidic key, so then we would try and figure out why is it here that we allow voluntarism to go to excess, even though ordinarily in other aspects of religious life we don't allow people to let their voluntarism get out of control, right? We require them to live within bounds, right? So that would be That would be the way to read. Okay, so to sum up, here's what I want to say. I want to think that you can find that I think Hasidic interpretation takes within those assumptions can be seen as a consistent mode. One of the ways in which you can see that is if I gave a group of different people those rules, would they roughly arrive at the same kinds of interpretations? I tried to show that the way reading Parshas Teruma as being fundamentally about the way in which Jews ought to relate to God, and not about the building of a building, is something that you might be able to find in Chazal, that philosophers understood Chazal as saying the same kind of thing, and that I think you can see that other people right can read other aspects of the right, that it's not a bad assumption at all to say that what must be going on in the Parshat of the Mishkan is it can't really be talking about the building of a building, because why would we spend so much time talking about the building of a building? And then there are so many interesting things about it, things which are contradictory in the context of the narrative, right? That things which are inconsistent with the middle of the text, grammatical things to pick up, right? A striking phrase, "V'shachanti v'socham." So I'm hoping that it was useful to see that the gap between what Hasidic interpretation and what comes previously is not a one of radical break, but more, I would try to argue, is we're taking something that generally was part of the process and saying this is what we're going to focus on. We're going to make everything about that, as opposed to this is just one of the things we're going to focus on. Okay, I didn't do the end of that as coherently as I would have liked, but this is out of my comfort zone anyway. So hopefully I get a little bit more space than I do ordinarily. Okay, are there questions?
No, this is good. It's good survey.
Okay. Yes.
No, thanks.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Shabbat shalom. Take care.
Shabbat shalom. We'll see
Bye.
what see what the break.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Very
Thank you
good.
all. Have a great Shabbos and happy Purim. We're not going to have a share next week, but we'll be back in 2 weeks.
Great. Shabbos. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.